Okay, ball's in your court. It's Q&A. Open Q&A.
What would you recommend for well, if it's like Gemara, right? It's most learning Gemara, it's more like at least me, a lot of people I've spoken to is very intellectual as opposed to spiritual. How do you balance the two? How do you combine the two together?
You combine the intellectual and the spiritual.
Are you supposed to?
You definitely are. The spiritual is supposed to embrace everything. Everything is under an umbrella of spirituality. Gemara is a particular challenge because it's very intellectually demanding. And especially when you're at the beginning, it's hard, I think, to access the spiritual levels of it. I'll give you an example. Let's suppose someone's learning to play an instrument. In the beginning, he's just concentrating on playing the right notes. He can't play music with expression, with feeling, with depth. He's got to play the notes. And that's demanding enough. That's hard enough. Person's learning to play chess. He's learning the moves. He's learning some combinations. He can't start thinking about a strategy that's going to work 6 moves down. He's not at that level of grasp, that level of control. The same thing's true here. You're worrying about translation. You're worrying about punctuation. You're worrying about where does the question end, where does the answer begin, and so on and so on. To access the spirituality of it is very difficult. Sometimes there are incidents in the Talmud or types of interaction which wear their spirituality on the face. For example, when somebody changes his mind, or someone makes a public announcement. I made a mistake. I'm letting everybody know that it was a mistake. So you see that these great people, scholars who are brilliant and whose fame spread out to the entire Jewish world, were not afraid to admit their errors. That, I think, already has a spiritual message. But to appreciate the beauty of an argument that has 7 premises and 13 steps of logic and bridges different subjects in a creative way, and to see how they tie into serving God, that's at a much later level of Talmudic understanding and grasp. In the meantime, there are other things that can be done to directly emphasize spirituality, and I think that a person should have a balance. One thing that I find very inspiring is biographies. Biographies of great people, and biographies of people who come from the ordinary rank and file of the Jewish population and have lived great lives because they strove to accomplish something. It has been observed that if you read the biography of a great Torah sage, it's interesting, it's fascinating, and it is easily separated from my life because I'm not a great person like that. So I just allow myself to not be obligated by what I read. But when you read books about people who, as I say, came from the rank and file and who lived outstanding lives, then it has a different impact on a person. And I can tell you that you will gain respect for individuality and creativity, also for the inability to anticipate the responses that people will give, great people who have a tremendous depth, and that can be a direct spiritual boost. So I think that you're right. There has to be some balance and some emphasis on spirituality. The other thing, in addition to reading biographies, is experience. Some people find it inspiring to go and daven at the Kosel, especially on Shabbos, Friday night. So I think experience is a good combination as well.
So I feel like personally I have a problem finding, where do we how do we relate to like the Gedolim or even people of past generations? So what I mean is, like I think I personally have a problem of sometimes maybe putting them too high. Maybe like, is there, for example, I don't know, maybe like put them on too high a pedestal when it may not, like even in our generation, when it may not be the case in our generation? Like, is there a difference to how you should like should you put them, is it fine to put them on a very high pedestal?
Yeah.
Like if they're on further back generations, but in this generation, if you put people on too high a pedestal, is it just misleading yourself?
I don't know.
Is it over like stepping over?
I believe in realism. I believe in looking at the world realistically, facing the facts as they are. I don't believe in exaggerating. I don't believe in underrating. But from the limited experience that I have had with Torah sages and Torah leaders, the danger of overestimating their abilities, I think, is very, very small. I think that we probably don't have a clue as to the abilities that they have. We don't have a clue. If we multiplied our impression by 1,000, we wouldn't come close to what they were capable of. I'll give you a few illustrations. Someone visited Rav Moshe Feinstein, Zechrono Livracha, when he was in his 80s. And he brought up a certain passage in the Talmud, and he mentioned the page on which it is found. And Rav Moshe said, "You're making a mistake, it's on the previous page." So the fellow said, "Look, Rav Moshe, I happen to be studying this now, and I know what page it's on." I said, let's go check. There wasn't a Talmud where they were. They had to go and walk a block, go to someplace else and check. They opened it up. Rav Moshe was right. And the visitor said to him, "Why was it so important to you to establish what page the passage was on?" And he said, "If I ever forgot what page the passage was on, I could never answer queries from memory again." He could never answer questions from memory again if he ever forgot the page that a passage was on. That was the standard that he held himself to. He called his nephew one day and said, "Tomorrow I'm celebrating something in shul, so please bring schnapps and cake." And the nephew said, "Uncle, what are you celebrating?" Whatever he called him. And he said, "Siyum of Shas, finishing Shas." So the nephew said, "How many times did you finish Shas?" Moshe said, "Twice." So the nephew said, "Come on, I know it's not twice. You must have finished many more times than that." "Well," said Rabbi Moshe, "the truth is, I have fulfilled a famous Talmudic dictum twice. The Talmudic dictum says, a person who studies his portion 100 times is not equivalent to someone who studies it 101 times. And I fulfilled that dictum twice, which means he had gone through the Talmud 202 times. At that stage of life, who knows what he did after that? No. Are you likely to exaggerate what these people know? I read the books that are written by people in our generation, the previous generation. I can't imagine doing something like that. I study halacha. I have a chavrusa, we study halacha every day. We could spend an hour on half of one page. There are thousands of pages. There are people who knew it all cold. We're not dumb. My friend is a PhD from MIT in something called nuclear physical chemistry. And we're not exactly dumb, but their brilliance and their grasp is just beyond belief. Rav Yoshev's grandfather wrote a classic in Kabbalah. The format is this big, is this thick, filled with tiny print, all on Kabbalah. I mean, I don't think a committee of 100 people sitting down and spending their whole lives on it could do something like that, ordinary people. So I don't think that we are in danger of exaggerating. Rav Chaim Kanievsky, every year in Sukkot, in the Chol HaMoed, he makes a celebration of his completing the study of Torah. All of the Babylonian Talmud, all of the Jerusalem Talmud, all of Maimonides, all of the Shulchan Aruch, all of the Midrash, every year. I'm talking about people who are enormous geniuses. I go to Manchester, England from time to time. There's a fellow there named Rav Simcha Bamberger. He teaches the Daf Yomi, the daily folio of the Talmud. He's employed by the community just to teach the Daf Yomi. He teaches 3 times a day, and that's all he does. I go to his shir, the 6 a.m. shir. He knows me so well that if I raise my hand to ask a question, he can say the question before I ask it. I can't budge him. I cannot budge him. He has absolute control of Shas. 2,700 folios, 5,400 pages of Talmud. He has absolute control of everything in the Shas. And he's not one of the great sages of the generation. He's not. He's someone who's paid to do the Daf Yomi and does a very excellent job. I'll never forget, I was there once, one of the participants asked a question, and he said to the fellow, the answer is in your bar mitzvah parsha. That means he knows the answer, he knows what verse it is, and he knows what this guy's bar mitzvah parsha is, put together instantly. I taught university for 10 years. I never met anyone who had that kind of control of his subject. No one, unheard of, to have that kind of absolute control of the material. So the chance of exaggerating beyond what their real abilities are, I think, is extremely unlikely. Extremely, on the contrary, what's much more likely is that we won't be able to appreciate the gigantic abilities that they have. But I don't believe in fantasizing. I believe in facing the world as realistically as possible. If you interact with them, thank you very much. If you interact with them and talk to them, so then you get a little hint of what they are. If you work on a text for a week with your chalusa and you beat it up this way and that way and you can't get it, and you walk over to one of these people who's not studying that subject and not teaching that subject at the present time, and you ask him and he says, "Oh, this is how you explain it. Just trivial. Just he has it in his pocket." So you get to realize that you're talking about a different kind of level of understanding. And what they do for people, the way they extend themselves for people, they're endless stories. So this goes back to what I was talking to you about. There's endless stories. Moshe Feinstein had a yeshiva, and it was known that once or twice a week there was an old woman who used to come in, and he used to break off teaching and do something for her, and then she would leave. Finally, one of the students, she came by, and he wasn't there. He was out of town. And she said, "Oh, that's terrible. That's terrible. He always helps me, and now he's not here to help me." So they asked her, "What does he help you with?" She said, "Well, I'm writing to my friends, my relatives in Russia. He translates for me from Russian into English, English into Russian, so I can write them letters." A woman off the street, I don't know whether she was religious, wasn't religious. She asked him for help, and he gave her help. You're talking about a different level altogether. To know that such a thing is possible, to know such a thing can be achieved by flesh and blood, as we say, it doesn't mean, as I said before, that doesn't mean that I'm going to make myself responsible to do it. But it's good to know that there are such people. And when it comes to respecting their scholarship, their decisions, and their leadership, it's important to know that you're dealing with people of that caliber. Yeah.
Speaking of mastering Torah, could you speak about the parameters of Bittul Torah for someone who may have an interest in other enriching aspects of life, like literature, music, science, and exactly finding an appropriate balance, and when is too much, and when it should be pursued more if they feel that they have what to give to the world in those areas?
Okay, you've asked the question with a number of different parameters, and you've put a few of them into the question. I can't give you a total answer. I don't think I'm capable of giving you a total answer, but I can discuss a couple of the points that you raised. First of all, it is certainly appropriate for a person to have a way of earning a living, and the way you earn your living ought to be something that you are good at, and you feel comfortable doing, and even to a certain extent feel inspired doing. That's something which is reasonable, and that requires education, subject to certain limitations, subject to certain parameters. If that requires education, secular education, there's no reason not to get it. Certain subjects involve studying matters that violates Jewish belief, then you have to ask a question. You have to get a legal opinion, a halachic opinion, whether that's appropriate. But it's certainly appropriate. A certain amount of relaxation, which can be dedicated to something that naturally interests you, is also okay. Rabbi Vassman writes about that. It is recorded in Rabbi Vassman's biography that he had a copy of perhaps the most difficult work in all of modern philosophy, Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. He had it in the bathroom, because that's where philosophies that aren't Torah philosophies should be read, in the bathroom, where you can't read anything else. We're not allowed to read anything holy. So, he obviously had an interest in it, and he didn't deny himself the interest, but he put it in the appropriate context. So, profession is one thing, and a natural interest, just because it's interesting, probably implicated here is a certain psychological balance. If there's something that interests you, and you don't ever get a chance to explore it, so then that can be depressing. It can rob you of some of your inspiration, rob you of some of your excitement, your energy, and that's also worth investing in by giving certain vent to that interest. As far as giving to the world is concerned, a person, I mean, this is obvious, but you asked it, a person should evaluate in what way he can make the most important contribution to the world. A person could say, I'm just fascinated by stamps, old stamps, historical stamps, where stamps develop, and I have a talent for recognizing, valuable stamps, entering stamps, and I could give something to the world. I could write a book about stamp collecting, and people would benefit from it. That is to say, the 0.0000001% of the population that collects stamps, they would definitely benefit from it, and I feel it would be a contribution. I think I would say to such a person, yeah, but isn't there anything else that would be more valuable than that? You have to weigh the value of what you can contribute. And from our point of view, serving God, expressing God's presence in the world, inspiring other people to serve God, is a far bigger contribution than designing a more efficient subway system, or proving a theorem of mathematics, or no matter how much prestige the rest of the world will give you for the other activities. From our point of view, the investment in the future is infinitely more important. It may not be measurable on the surface. We don't measure things on the surface. We don't take them into account that way. So, and that requires some Torah expertise to evaluate where the greater contribution can be made. And the fact that I'm naturally interested in it may not be the most important factor. I can tell you for myself, I've learned the Daf Yomi for more than 35 years. It's something which I'm committed to, and I get tremendous satisfaction from and inspiration from. I would love to give a Daf Yomi shir. I have a friend who gives, and from time to time I fill in for him. It's wonderful. So why don't I do it? Because there are 10,000 people in the world who can give very good Daf Yomi shir. And because of my particular training, dealing with problems of philosophy and problems of science and so on, which very few people can do, so that's what I have to do, because that's where I can make my biggest contribution, my biggest difference in the way the world develops. So a mature person has to sometimes sacrifice his own interest for the impact that it has and what its responsibilities are. When you will have children, you will be constantly faced by the choice between learning another very clever, important, fundamental, subtle idea, and talking to your 6-year-old about why light bulb goes on when you push the switch. And your investment in your children most often will take precedence over learning that new sophisticated idea. As intriguing as it is, as inspiring as it is, you owe the attention to your children. So all of that has to be taken into account. By the way, if you do have to study material that is questionable from a Jewish point of view, and you get a legal decision that it's okay for you to do so, there are times, circumstances in which it is, what I recommend that you do is study it all in quotation marks. Let's say you're studying evolution. Well, what you're studying is Darwin said this, and Russell said that, and Wallace said that, and Ernst Mayr said that, and it's all in quotation marks. And when they give you an exam, you say, well, he says this, and he says this, and he says this, and he says that. Me? Ha! I'm on another planet, Forget it, this is your fantasy. But you're not asking me about me. You're asking what I know about your fantasy. Well, here's what I know about your fantasy. Just pour it out with quotation marks. That way you protect yourself from it. Yeah.
Regarding about the bus, what should he focus on and learn in terms of learning?
That's a very, very important question. Not many people ask it. Rabbi Pindrus has a program which I think is guided towards preparing people to be a working and contributing citizen to the Jewish religious world. One of my sons worked up a schedule for that. I'm not an expert in this, but I'll tell you what I think. First of all, competence in Talmud is necessary because if you don't have that, then in our circles, you'll be a second-class citizen. It's not true everywhere. There are Orthodox, religious, Jewish circles in which you could be incompetent in Talmud and not be a second-class citizen. That's because those circles have much lower scholarly standards altogether. In our circles, if you can't read a Gemara, if you can't follow a Gemara, you can't follow a citation or an argument that's based on a Gemara, then you're going to be a second-class citizen. So getting up to par, competence is one goal. The second goal is practical halacha, for sure, because you're going to live in the community. You're going to run a household. And although today, women also know a lot of halacha. And that's good for men, because a lot of men don't know a lot of halacha. They have to be reminded from time to time how little they really know. So you have a partner in that. Basic hashkafa, basic Jewish philosophy. You need to know what we believe and why we believe it and how we can answer at least some of the challenges that come from the secular world. Basic chumash. A person has to have a knowledge of basic chumash. That means going through the parsha of the week. If you do that, in a few years, you'll have basic knowledge of what's going on. And you can always deepen it, but at least you should have basic knowledge of chumash because it's discussed so often. It comes up all the time. It's important to have some basic knowledge of that. Some understanding of the siddur. You're going to daven out of the siddur every day, 3 times a day, sometimes 4 times a day. The basic knowledge of the siddur. I would say those are the main areas. Then there are other things as well, but those are the main areas. And a very good investment in all learning is to gain some mastery of Hebrew. I don't mean necessarily going to an ulpan and learning how to order a hamburger in a restaurant, but basic grammar and basic vocabulary. There's a wonderful edition of the Chumash that came out a few years ago. In the front, it's the regular Chumash with Rashi and Onkelos and the very translation. In the back, you have the entire text of the book in gray print with the root of each word in black print, or vice versa. So that for every word, you can instantly see what the root of the word is. And in the beginning, it has certain rules as to how words are built out of roots. I think that's terrific. It's terrific. Because if you look at that a little bit, 5 lines. Look at 5 lines a week, you get used to the fact that the words have structure, they're built in logical ways. There are analogies between the ways the words are built. You can learn at least some grammar by osmosis that way. So if you invest in Hebrew, that will increase the efficiency with which you do everything else. And if you have the time and the ability to do it, a couple of hours a day for a few months in Hebrew, I think will make a big difference. Yeah.
A few questions. One, okay, you mentioned about evolution. I know you have Sherm on this online. So I was just wondering, is it tenable from a Jewish perspective the idea that evolution was that it was a gradual process that was directed by Hashem's hand, and so that creation really did take place over? I mean, the year thing, I don't really, it doesn't really bother me, but I'm saying it was a gradual progression from, to reaching up to man as the pinnacle, or is it very definitively that man is completely separate creation from the rest of the animals?
Okay, if you're talking specifically about the creation of man, the text in Genesis is absolutely clear. Each thing gets created, heavens and earth and plants and animals and fish and birds as categories, and the very same language is used for creating man specifically, forming his body and breathing into him a soul of life. So, if you're not going to play games with the text, then you're forced to say that it's a separate creation. I also think that I would recommend, don't let yourself be pushed around by science in general, and certainly not by popular science. People who write in science have agendas. And one very widespread agenda, not everybody shares it, widespread agenda is to say that people are not special. We are slightly smarter squirrels. Evolution means that we have animal bodies and animal brains and so on and so on. And there may be differences of degree, but they aren't fundamental, they aren't categorical, and so on and so on. Now, I say, don't let yourself be pushed around by that. Sit back and ask yourself, what do I know about the world? What do I know about the animal world? What do I know about the human world? Does this make sense or doesn't it? I'll give you an example, and this is going to take a little while. This example has a double moral. It has been said and publicized that we share 98.6% of our genes with chimpanzees. And then the follow-up thought is, well, that's scientific. Well, they did that on the basis of comparing the DNA. So that's real. So that means we are 98.6% chimpanzees. So that means we're really very, very, very chimpanzee-like. The difference between us and chimpanzees can't be more than 1.4%. I think that's idiotic. Okay, chimpanzees have opposed thumbs. That's true. And they eat bananas, and sometimes human beings eat bananas. And they do have rudimentary intelligence. If you put a chimpanzee into a room, there's a banana hanging from the center, and there's a chair over there and a table over there. The chimpanzee will pull the table over the center, take the chair, use the chair to climb up on the table, and the table get up to the banana. So they do have rudimentary intelligence. Does that compare with Beethoven or Shakespeare or differential equations or spaceships to the moon or poetry or social organizations involving millions of individuals? Come on. Be realistic. The difference here is gigantic. It's enormous. So the first thing to say is, well, if the difference is gigantic and enormous, maybe 1.4% difference of genes can make a much bigger difference than we thought. Instead of using the tiny number of 1.4% to blind yourself to the gigantic differences, turn the equation upside down and say, well, apparently, maybe very small genetic changes can make very big differences in output, because the differences in output are given. They're undeniable. That's the first thing to say. But don't let yourself be bullied into denying obvious fact. Like comparing human beings with chimpanzees, give me a break. And I want you to know, the supposed intelligence of chimpanzees is greatly overrated. There's a wonderful book that came out from Oxford about 3-4 years ago called Not a Chimp, written by a science writer. I don't know how a science writer published a book with Oxford, but he did a lot of research, and he did a lot of research into chimpanzee intelligence, and he found great weaknesses. They're tool using, right? They use tools. That's one of the things they're supposed to have in common with people. Give a chimpanzee a tool like this that has a handle, and at the end of the handle it has something like this. 2 legs and a bar, and the handle goes in here, right? Put food behind a barrier with a hole, and give him the tool, and what does he do? He takes the tool like this, and goes like this, and pulls, and misses it a dozen times, right? All he would have to do is turn it over, and use the flat back. get the food. He doesn't think of that. He just keeps using it like this over and over and over again. That's not very smart. In this book, there's a chapter on crows. Crows turn out to be very smart, even though they're divided from us in the evolutionary development, supposedly by many orders of magnitude, and chimpanzees are supposed to be so close. Crows turn out to be smarter than chimpanzees sometimes. So don't be bullied by the science that's going on. But let me tell you something else. I mean, this is just too delicious to give up. So we share 98.6% of our genes with chimpanzees, do we? Let me tell you something. The DNA is divided into two groups. The parts of the DNA that code for building proteins and the rest. The part that builds for proteins is about 5%. The rest does not. Until about 15 years ago, it had its own name, junk DNA. Doesn't build for proteins, that's a function of DNA, is to build for proteins, so that's just junk. Well, evolution predicts you'll carry stuff along from previous species, and it's not useful now, and just carry it along, because evolution is a tinkerer and doesn't create anything new, and just you work with the material it's given, so this was considered to be a prediction of evolution and a confirmed prediction and all the rest. In the last 15 years, that's been coming apart. The last test, 80% of the DNA is chemically active. Junk is not chemically active. If it's chemically active, then it can be affected by evolution. So it should be expected to be sculpted to evolution to be functional. And lots of functions have been discovered for the so-called junk, and more are being discovered every week. Here's the one that I like best. So imagine the DNA, it's a gigantic molecule. A few tiny stretches code for proteins and others don't. But it's really worse than that, because in a stretch that codes for proteins, there are little snippets that don't code. They're called interons. So here's the process. The RNA comes and copies the DNA and comes out. Then it breaks up into pieces. The interons drop out because they don't code. The rest of it is stitched together, and then it goes to a machine that builds a protein out of it. What a kludge. What a stupid, inefficient system. Put in things that don't work, take it out, copy the whole thing, drop them out, resplice it together. What a kludge. Guess what, boys and girls? One stretch of DNA can code for 20 different proteins. One stretch can code for 20 different proteins, because there are 20 different ways of sewing together the pieces. Not just one way, but 20 ways. And guess what? The little interons that drop out dictate how you sew them together in 20 different ways. Pretty clever, hey? Not a kludge at all. Do you know a piece of computer code that does 20 different jobs? Probably not, because human engineering isn't up to it. But the DNA is up to it. So, the question now is, when they came up with that figure that our DNA and chimpanzee DNA are 98.6% identical, what were they looking at? Answer, they were looking only at the 5% that codes for proteins. They weren't looking at the rest of it, because they were convinced that it was useless. If you look at the whole of the DNA, the overlap is only 70%, not 98.6%. So you have a dogma based on no evidence, which led to a false comparison, and people were beat up by that. Oh, it's just nothing but chimpanzees. That's breathtaking, Don't let yourself be beat up by this kind of stuff. Don't throw away your intuition, so you look at human beings. The discontinuity between human beings and the rest of the world as we know it is gigantic. It's gigantic. And people who know what's going on, like Thomas Nagel, whom I quote over and over again, for whom I have a world of respect, he writes several times that the prospect of evolution explaining human intelligence is very, very remote. Nothing that we have, understanding the way evolution works, has any relevance to explaining human intelligence. So I think in scientific terms, the idea that it's just a seamless process of gradual refinements is something which an unbiased observer has to say doesn't fit the facts. From the point of view of the biblical text, there's no hope. There's absolutely no hope. If you asked about a more modest proposition, forget about human creation, but the general description of the development of the world as compared with the scientific description, couldn't it be what certain religions have called, and even some Jews have been seduced into this, it's called theistic evolution or guided evolution? Then I think the right answer to that is, if you had only the biblical text, you might be able to do that. But having only the biblical text is fantasy land. We don't live with only the biblical text. It's totally incompetent to do that. We have a giant tradition in which the biblical text is embedded. Our responsibility is to the tradition as a whole. And that gives you absolutely no hope for an idea that it followed all the evolutionary steps and God was behind it, hiding his presence. Obviously, he could have done that. The question is, what does the tradition say about whether he really did it or not? And that's, from the point of view of the tradition as a whole, it's hopeless.
How do you gain, how does one learn to get used to and appreciate other drachim, like Avodas Hashem? And not look at them bad, think yourself is much better.
Yeah. Get used to other ways of serving HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Of course, the best way is to experience them, to actually go and spend, you have to pledge allegiance or spend months and months, but to experience what they regard as key experiences, and to try to appreciate what it means for them. And usually then you'll see that there's something there which what you're used to doesn't stress, and it's a place where what you're used to has certain strengths, and they have certain strengths as well. I don't know if you've ever been to a Hasidic Tish. The sons of Hasidim, Netanya, sons of Rabbi is a gigantic scholar. And he's world recognized. This country, he's very highly respected. When the Mir opened a new branch, they invited him to speak at the dedication. What happened? The Finkel, the Vracha, spoke first, and the sons of Rebbe got up and had a comment, remark, question, and answer on each of Rav Finkel's points. He sat there, listened to it, and for every point he had something to say, on the spot. About 10 years ago, there was a completion of the Jerusalem Talmud, and the sons of Rebbe was asked to be the one to be Messiah, to say in Binyanei Ha'umah. So he's recognized everywhere. Now, they have a Tish Friday night. The Tish starts 4 hours after Lech Benchen, after candlelighting. I was there once. It was summertime, so Tish started, 11 o'clock at night. Here's how the Tish goes. He makes Kiddush, he makes a motzi, and he speaks for an hour. He hasn't eaten in the intro. The Hasidim have eaten, he hasn't eaten. He speaks for an hour. For 40 minutes, he says what we call a pilpul on Gemara. He speaks about Talmud, no books, everything from memory. Speaking about various portions and commentaries and comparing and contrasting them and asking questions, resolving. And I noticed, you could tell that they were following him, because if he would pause, they would finish the sentence for him. So they were definitely following him. They weren't sleeping. And the last 20 minutes, he spoke what's called Musar, ethical themes, quoting from texts all over. And after an hour's discourse, from 11:30 at night until 12:30 at night, then he began with the songs and with handing out the food and so forth and so on. That's breathtaking. It's breathtaking. And the spirit and the unity and the sense of connection. Shalashudas, where the children come up to him, he gives to each child and pats each child's cheek, you see something. Our youngest, when he put on tefillin, our Rebbe wasn't here, so we went to Tzanz, and we davened with the Tzanz Rebbe. It was a Friday morning, and he has a private minyan in a room in his house. Maybe 20, 25 people there, very close Hasidim. Shachris, the morning services took an hour and a half. It was like a revelation. Each psalm in the Psalms was said calmly, thoughtfully, contemplatively. Finished, he went on to the next psalm. I don't think I could do that every day. I know I can't do it every day, but it was like a revelation. There's something to be gained from that kind of davening. The Dushinsky Hasidim over here, when we used to live here 30 years ago, I used to go there particularly for Sfiras Omer, counting the Omer. How long does Sfiras Omer take? Well, if you're lucky enough to be in yeshiva here, about 45 seconds. Because all they do is say the blessing and say the day and then skip to... Okay, if you say all the other stuff, it could take you 4 or 5 minutes. It took 25 minutes. 25 minutes. The roof was shaking for 25 minutes. So walk out of there. Boy, today was 36. Really? Today is 36. It's really 36. It's a very intense experience. Now, I don't know how that sounds to people, but compare it with the Super Bowl or the idiotic Mondial, which everybody's watching all over the world. Do you know there's an Israeli in the middle of the South American jungles who has a setup there for Israelis who are in South America? They can watch the World Cup. I mean, kicking a ball into a and people are screaming and cheering or crying their eyes out because this one won and this one lost. Human enthusiasm for great skill and great accomplishment is universal. Why waste it on kicking balls into nets? You're talking about celebrating something sublime, something beautiful, something awesome. So different groups have emphasized different areas of service. Singing and dancing. The Kuzari writes that a person who serves God wholeheartedly from time to time will feel so enthusiastic about serving God, he will spontaneously break into song and dance. That was written 1,000 years ago. And the Hasidim do that from time to time. And other groups don't do that. So then there's a statement in the Kuzari which is being lived today by Hasidim that isn't being lived by some other groups. So there definitely are things to learn. There are certain groups where the study schedule, the subject that is studied in yeshiva is very narrowly defined. It's Gemara, and Gemara, and Gemara, and some Rishonim on Gemara, and some Achronim on Gemara, and Gemara. Also Gemara. That's it, right? Well, there are other groups that believe in a more varied diet. Halacha, comprehensive study of Gemara rather than narrow, deep analysis of Gemara, or at least combining the two, and basic Jewish philosophy. Particular Hasidic yeshivas, when you study Hasidic Sfarim, a certain extent of it is dedicated to what we would think of as philosophical themes. The Naos Desher, written by the first Sachach of Rabbi, on one page quotes the Zohar and Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed. And he's writing that for his Hasidim. Natural, right? The other yeshivas that I'm referring to, you will never open the Guide of the Perplexed. Never. Okay. That's a way of serving God. There's another way of serving God, which has a much broader perspective and talks about fundamentals of Jewish thinking, Jewish believing, Jewish feeling. I think that if you circulate a little bit, you talk to people, you can build that kind of appreciation. My Rabbi Zatzal was he stressed very much appreciating the contributions that the different strands of Halachic Judaism provide. He sent all of his boys to learn in Misnagdish yeshivas. They learned in Lakewood, in Philadelphia, in Ponevezh. They're all strong Hasidim, but that's where you can get the greatest technical analysis. Go there and get that. So he tried to take what he could get from the various strands, the ones that he couldn't take from directly. He had great respect for, and they had great respect for him. Yeah.
This day and age, like when I see like Litvish Mahalach, like I see a very lacking in basic spirituality. Like the Ruchnius is there, but kind of without the Ruchnius. Like is that like I understand maybe 100, 200 years ago that it was possible to combine the two like that, but nowadays is that really the right way to do it?
I'll tell you, I think that the literature world practices a very great degree of tznius. Tznius means privacy. It means not attracting attention. I remember when I first went into a Litvish yeshiva, and they were davening. I looked around. I couldn't tell who the Rosh Yeshiva was. He didn't look different from anybody else. He's standing in the front of the room, so were other people standing in front of the room. They're just, not attracting attention. They don't daven any longer than anybody else. But my guess is that if you had a picture of the inside, you would see something very exalted. I don't think that it would be just dry and cut the way it seems on the outside, but it's not. There's no show. There's no show. The Hasidic world took a different approach, that in order to inspire people, you have to show. And therefore, the Rebbes did express themselves in that way, and the Hasidim were encouraged to express themselves in that way, because, like the Sefer Chinuch says, your actions stimulate your emotions and your spiritual growth. So you have to act in a certain way before you've really achieved that inner level, because that's the way you will achieve the inner level. Person is changed by the way in which he acts. So I think there are different approaches. But you have to be honest with yourself. If you need that kind of inspiration, then you should seek it, or at least seek it on occasion. I'm not talking about necessarily changing your whole approach or your whole Jewish identity, but at least seek it on occasion, and that's what many people do. Some Hasidim, on Simchas Torah, only the Rebbe dances. The Hasidim are there in the bleachers, and they're singing and they may be swaying back and forth, but only the Rebbe dances on the floor, and the Hasidim don't dance. That would kill me. That would just kill me. I have to dance. I sit in the bleachers and just, for them, that's exalted because he's dancing. Look who he is. And by the way, what happened in the interim days of the Sukkot festival in the temple? You had Simchas Beis Shoeva, the rejoicing of bringing the water up for the libations on the altar. Who danced and performed there? Only the greatest. The rest watched. So that Hasidic practice, that group, has a basis. It has a background. Just that not everybody can do that. And not everybody should do that. If that's inspiring to you, wonderful. And if you need something else, then go someplace else where you can get it. Yeah.
Could you speak about the relationship between different religious communities and how one who finds virtues, this relates to our discussion, finds virtues in, various, virtues and vices for their life in various communities. I'm talking Hasidim, Litvish, Dati Lumi, Modern Orthodox, and for someone who's, choosing a mahalach, what could you give some eitzah on as to, I guess, how to go about, pick, is it appropriate to pick and choose, or is it appropriate to, remain loyal to one, and when is it appropriate to make a commitment, and so forth?
Yeah. Well, there's a key element here. You cannot raise a family in a pick and choose mode. You cannot do that. Children have to have an identity. And you have to be part of their social context. They have to feel a community, solidarity in the community, and that their parents are part of the community. That's very important for their sense of security. And if you're on the outside and picking and choosing, 9 times out of 10, the children are going to suffer because of that. Number one. So you got to choose an identification. Now, choosing identification, like anything else in life, there are ups and downs. Everything has ups and downs. Your job has ups and downs. Your davening has ups and downs. Your marriage has ups and downs. Nothing in life is pure. And what you have to do for yourself is identify in yourself what's essential and what's peripheral. What things do I need? And what things would I like and I would enjoy, but I don't need? That's going to vary from person to person. For Baalei Tshuva, often what's needed is a Baal Tshuva context. If there aren't other people around like me, going through what I'm going through, and facing my challenges, and I can talk to and expect to be understood, then I'm going to be an orphan. And I can't live that way. And that may be a crucial element. And you may therefore want to join a community of people where there's a sizable number of Baalei Tshuva with whom you can share. And then your children will be in that group of children and part of that community, and then they'll grow up in their own way. Their identification will usually be different because they're not growing up as Baalei Tshuva, but you need your support system, so to speak. Even so, you can benefit from a shir here and there, or the readings here and there of other groups. But the identity has to be clear, and it has to be clear in the house. It has to be clear on the street. It has to be clear to the children. They cannot grow up with that with a split identity or a non consistent identity. That's absolutely crucial. And for yourself, if you don't fool yourself into thinking it must be a perfect option. If I haven't found it, I'm missing out. But every option has its pluses and minuses. I sometimes tell women, in a certain sense, you have a great advantage because you don't have to daven with a minyan. Every man who davens with a minyan is making compromises because no minyan is perfect. Some are too fast, and some are too slow, and some are too belabored, and some are too demonstrative, some are not demonstrative enough, some of the wrong accent, whatever you want. A man is always making a compromise. I think in a way, that's one of the reasons why men have to do it. They have to learn to compromise. They have to learn to bond with others through compromise. Bonding for men is not as natural as it is for women. It's harder. And they have to be, just put their nose to the grindstone and make themselves do it. But it's a strain. It's not easy. A woman, okay, she's the precious of the home. But when she decides to daven, she can daven her own pace, her own emphasis, her own rhythm. She has that freedom to do it. Even if she comes to shul, she doesn't keep up with the men. She has to daven at the same pace. So anyway, then when you choose a place to daven, it's a playoff. Like everything else is a playoff, it's a playoff. You have to choose the package that's best for you. And the crucial thing to do in making that choice is identify for yourself what's crucial and what's peripheral. It was something be nice to have, but it's not absolutely essential.